There were 400 people in that studio, but when that heartbeat echoed through the speakers, only one woman could hear her son. The cameras were rolling. The lights were warm and golden, casting their familiar glow across Oprah's iconic stage. A woman named Grace sat on the curved couch, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes carrying the weight of 8 years of grief. She was 54 years old, a retired nurse from Atlanta, a mother who had buried her only child and somehow kept breathing anyway. 8 years ago, her son Marcus had died in a car accident. He was 19 years old, a sophomore in college, a boy who wanted to be an architect, who made everyone laugh, who called his mother every Sunday without fail. The drunk driver walked away without a scratch. Marcus was declared brain dead 3 hours after the ambulance arrived. In the darkest moment of her life, Grace made a decision that would save 5 people she would never meet. She donated her son's organs. But what she didn't know, what no one in that studio could have predicted, was that one of those people was about to walk onto this stage. And he was carrying something Grace hadn't heard in 8 years, her son's heart. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Grace had always believed that Marcus would outlive her. That was the natural order of things. Parents go first, children carry on. But on a rainy October night in 2016, that order shattered into a million pieces. Marcus had been driving home from a study group. He was 2 miles from campus when a pickup truck ran a red light at 60 miles per hour. The impact crushed the driver's side of his small sedan. By the time paramedics arrived, Marcus was unconscious. He never woke up. Grace remembered every detail of that night with terrible clarity. The phone call from an unknown number, the voice of a stranger telling her to come to the hospital immediately, the fluorescent lights of the ICU, the doctor's face when he said the words, "no brain activity." She remembered holding her son's hand, still warm, still soft, still her baby's hand, and knowing that he was already gone. The decision to donate his organs came easier than she expected. Marcus had talked about it once, casually, over dinner. He had just gotten his driver's license and was filling out the forms. "I checked the organ donor box, Mom," he had said between bites of spaghetti. "If something happens to me, I want to help someone else. What's the point of taking perfectly good organs into the ground?" She had laughed and told him nothing was going to happen. He was 17. He had his whole life ahead of him. 2 years later, she signed the consent forms in a hospital hallway, her hands shaking so badly the nurse had to guide the pen. Marcus's heart went to a 20-year-old man in Florida who had been on the transplant list for 2 years. His kidneys went to a grandmother and a teenage girl. His liver went to a father of 3. His corneas gave sight to a woman who had been blind since birth. 5 lives saved, 5 families whose prayers were answered. Grace told herself this should bring comfort, and sometimes, on good days, it did. But most days, all she could think about was the silence, the terrible silence of a house without her son's laugh, without his footsteps on the stairs, without his voice calling, "Hey, Mom, I'm home." She had never met any of the recipients. She wasn't sure she wanted to. Part of her feared that seeing her son's heart in another person's chest would be too much. Another part of her longed for it desperately, one more connection to the boy she had lost. For 8 years, Grace lived in that limbo, until Oprah's producers called. Oprah had read Grace's file 3 times. She had studied every detail, every photograph, every letter Grace had written to Marcus on his birthdays, even though he could no longer read them. But what struck Oprah most was a single line in Grace's intake interview. "I haven't heard his heartbeat since the day he died. Sometimes I forget what it sounded like, and that terrifies me more than anything." Oprah understood loss. She had lived through her own grief, her own complicated relationship with motherhood and the children she never had. But there was something about Grace's story that cut deeper than most. The idea of a mother's love literally living on in another person's chest. The possibility of hearing that love beat again. The interview had been emotional from the start. Grace spoke about Marcus with a mixture of pride and pain that made the audience reach for their tissues. He was the kind of kid who made friends everywhere he went, Grace said, a sad smile crossing her face. Grocery stores, waiting rooms, airports. He'd strike up a conversation with anyone. He used to say, "Mom, everyone has a story. You just gotta ask." She reached into her purse and pulled out a worn photograph. Marcus, at his high school graduation, grinning at the camera with that infectious smile. He wanted to be an architect. He used to draw buildings on napkins at restaurants, on the margins of his homework, everywhere. He said he wanted to design homes that made people feel safe. Her voice caught. He made me feel safe, every single day. Oprah nodded, her own eyes glistening. He sounds like he had an old soul. He did. He really did. Grace's voice wavered. The hardest part isn't the big moments, you know. It's the small ones. Seeing a movie he would have loved. Hearing a song he used to sing in the shower. Cooking spaghetti and setting 2 plates before I remember. Finding his old sneakers in the closet and holding them because they still smell like him. She paused, her hands trembling. I donated his organs because I knew he would have wanted that. But for 8 years, I've wondered about the people walking around with pieces of my son inside them. I've wondered if they're happy, if they're living lives Marcus would be proud of. Oprah leaned forward. Have you ever tried to contact them? Grace shook her head. I was afraid it would hurt too much, afraid it wouldn't feel like him at all. She looked down at her hands. But lately, I've been thinking. What if I could just hear it one more time? His heart. Just hear it beating and know that part of him is still alive somewhere. The words hung in the air like a prayer. Oprah felt something shift in her chest. In 40 years of interviews, she had heard thousands of wishes, thousands of hopes, thousands of desperate longings. But this one reached into her own heart and squeezed. Grace, Oprah said softly, what if I told you that wish is about to come true? Grace looked up, confusion flickering across her face. What do you mean? We found him. The man who received Marcus's heart. His name is David. He's 28 years old now, a husband, a father, a cardiac nurse. He was so moved by receiving a heart that he dedicated his life to helping other heart patients. Grace's hand flew to her mouth. Her whole body began to tremble. He's here today, Grace. He came because he wants to meet the woman who gave him a second chance at life. And he brought something with him. Oprah paused, her own eyes glistening. He brought a stethoscope, so you can hear your son's heart again. What happens next will stay with you forever. Share this story now. The man who walked onto that stage was tall and healthy, with kind eyes and a nervous smile. He wore a simple blue button-down shirt, and in his right hand, he carried a medical stethoscope. Grace rose from the couch on unsteady legs. She stared at David like she was looking at a ghost, because in a way, she was. Somewhere inside this stranger's chest, her son's heart was beating. David stopped a few feet away. His eyes were already wet. Mrs. Mitchell, he said, his voice thick with emotion, I've wanted to meet you for 8 years. I've written you 100 letters I never sent because I couldn't find the right words. He pressed his hand to his chest, to Marcus's heart. Your son saved my life. I was 20 years old, dying from a heart condition I'd had since birth. The doctors gave me 3 months. David paused, the memory still raw after all these years. The night before I got the call, I wrote goodbye letters to my parents. I couldn't walk to the mailbox without losing my breath. I was 20 years old, preparing to die. His voice broke. Then the phone rang. A heart was available, a perfect match. Grace was crying silently, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't know his name for a long time," David continued. "But I knew he was 19. I knew he was an organ donor by choice. And I knew that his mother made the hardest decision anyone could ever make so that I could live." He took a step closer. "I became a cardiac nurse because of Marcus. I've helped hundreds of heart patients because of him. I got married, and I held my daughter for the first time because of him." David's tears fell freely now. "Everything good in my life exists because your son had a good heart, and I mean that in every possible way." Grace couldn't speak. She could barely stand. Oprah moved to her side, steadying her with a gentle hand. David held up the stethoscope. "Mrs. Mitchell, I know this might be overwhelming. I know this might be too much, but I brought this because I hoped, maybe you'd want to hear him again." Grace looked at the stethoscope like it was the most precious object in the world. Her voice came out as a whisper. Please, I need to hear him." David nodded. He placed the earpieces in Grace's ears with gentle hands. Then he guided the chest piece to his heart, to Marcus's heart, and held it there. The studio fell completely silent. 400 people holding their breath, cameras capturing every tear, Oprah standing with her hand pressed over her own heart, watching a mother reconnect with her child across the impossible distance of death. And then Grace heard it. Thump, 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 thump. Her son's heart, beating, alive, still going after 8 years of silence. Grace collapsed against David's chest, her body racked with sobs so deep they seemed to come from her very soul. She pressed her ear directly against his shirt, against the chest that held her boy's heart, and she wept like she hadn't wept since the night he died. "He's still here," she sobbed. "Oh my God, he's still here. I can hear him. I can hear my baby." David wrapped his arms around her, this stranger who was no longer a stranger, this man who carried her son inside him. He held her while she cried, his own tears falling into her gray hair. "He's here, Mrs. Mitchell," David whispered. "He's been here the whole time, beating for both of us." The audience rose to their feet. Not applause, something beyond applause, something sacred. Some people were openly weeping. Others had their hands raised to their hearts, feeling their own heartbeats with new awareness. Oprah wiped her tears, her voice barely steady. "Grace, do you understand what's happening right now? This is your moment. Marcus isn't gone. He's been living a second life through David. Every beat of that heart is your son saying, 'I'm still here, Mom. I'm still here.'" Grace pulled back just enough to look at David's face. She cupped his cheeks in her hands, a mother's gesture, ancient and instinctive. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for taking care of him. Thank you for living." David broke completely. "No, thank you. Thank you for giving me the chance." They held each other again, mother and heart-son, connected by loss and love and the miracle of second chances. When they finally separated, Grace kept her hand pressed against David's chest. She couldn't stop touching the place where Marcus lived on. "Can I—" she started, then stopped. "Can I meet your daughter? Marcus would have been an uncle by now. I'd like to think—" "Part of him is watching over her," David smiled through his tears. "She's backstage. Her name is Hope, and I'd be honored if she could call you Grandma." Grace's face transformed. For the first time in 8 years, something that looked like pure joy broke through the grief. "I'd like that," she whispered. "I'd like that very much." 6 months later, Oprah received a photograph. Grace sitting on a porch swing, a 2-year-old girl with curly hair in her lap. David beside them, his arm around his mother and wife. 4 generations of a family connected not by blood, but by something deeper. On the back of the photograph, Grace had written, "He's not gone. He's just living a different story now. And what a beautiful story it is." Tucked inside the envelope was a second photo, an ultrasound. David and his wife were expecting their second child, a boy. They were naming him Marcus. Oprah placed both photographs on her shelf because television was never about the lights or the cameras. It was about this: a mother who donated her son's heart, a man who lived because of that gift. And the moment a stethoscope bridged the gap between grief and gratitude. Some hearts never stop beating. They just find new homes. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. Some goodbyes aren't final. Some love finds a way to keep going, even when we think it's lost forever. That's the legacy of that afternoon. A heartbeat that echoed through a studio. A mother who heard her son again. And a family that grew from the ashes of loss. Because sometimes the bravest thing we can do is not hold on. It's letting go and trusting that love will find its way back. For Grace, for Marcus, for David, for the heart that refused to stop.